Welcome back to the Econ 101 unit for block number 3. This block is going to get into value, it's going to get into barter, into money, supply and demand, and other kind of business economic types of topics. So come along, let's jump in and see what this unit has to offer. The first slide we're going to look at is right here, has to do with value. So we talked about in class along the way that the basic principle of economics is that people need and want stuff, and people ultimately are going to produce things for the things that people need and want. This example is great right here. We have this kid, I'm hungry, I want my dinner. So this kid is demonstrating a basic need that he has. He's hungry. That's kind of the first part of value, is this idea of having kind of this desire, this want. Now this kid has his desire and his want, he's hungry, and let's just say that this is his dad that's going out and farming and getting the thing he wants. Now, if this dad actually goes out and works to, let's just say, make a piece or farm for a piece of corn for this kid, when he comes back and gives the kid the corn, if this kid wants the corn and he thinks it's delicious and he eats it, then value has been created. Now, the things don't always go as planned. You might have the start of value where you have a need or a want where this kid's hungry, and then this dad goes out and he puts work into getting a piece of corn. But then when he brings the corn back, let's say the kid's just like, I hate corn, I don't like corn. Well, if the work doesn't match the demand, then you don't have value. It's like the work was worthless. So what is value? It's work that matches the demand, and that's essentially what creates value. So value really is kind of a two-part deal. You got to have the need and the want, and then you have to have work put into it to try and meet the need or the want with whatever the product or service is. So how do we store value? So one of the main concepts of value is how do you store it? This piece of corn is a great example because, as you can see, here is some corn. Corn's great. Let's just say the dad worked and made it for, or farmed it for his kid, and it's ready to go. The problem is the value is limited in time, because we all know that this happens to a lot of things that have value, is that they'll go bad, they'll go rotten. So because of that, it's not the best store of value. And in economics, being able to store value, as we're going to see, is a pretty important concept. Barter is anytime you have multiple people, so I'll just jump to this example, and each person has something that the other person may or may not think is valuable. Now, barter is one way that you can exchange goods to get what you need or you want, but it's not the best way. One of the problems that you run into is, let's say that you have apples and this person has, say, grain. If the person doesn't want apples at that moment and you don't want grain at that moment, then you don't necessarily have something that's valuable to the person. So that's why barter gets a little tricky, where you might have to then start finding in a marketplace other people and working out deals where you try and get it to get each person getting what they want or what they need. So barter works for the exchange, but it's not the most efficient and best. If barter is one way to exchange and get the things that you want or you need, and it's a chance for somebody to produce what people want or need, then the next kind of progression is the idea of money. So the very first type of money started off as essentially being a valuable good in itself. So some of the very first forms of money were things like gold, salt, seashells, jewelry. One thing that these goods had in common is that they were limited in supply. That's kind of a core of almost any currency. You can't have unlimited of it, otherwise people can get it from wherever. The example I always like to use is, let's say that there was a person who had seashells as money, and there was a limited amount and everybody wanted to try and get one or two because they were so limited. If somebody just came along and dumped out like 10,000 or a million seashells, then why is somebody going to think that the ones I have are valuable? They'll just walk over to the big stack at a million and grab those. That is the core of a money, is it has to be limited in supply. And some of the first forms of money, they were exactly that. They were limited in their supply. And another thing that they had in common is that they were also goods. Like you had people who had made jewelry. Salt you could also use to make your food taste good. Gold you could also make for jewelry. So some of the first money started as pretty much like a good in itself, that then became a form. The other bonus of some of the very first monies is that pretty quickly people figured out that corn probably isn't the best kind of money. I know fish comes up in class. We talk about that as well. Fish probably isn't very good either, because if you're walking around with a bunch of fish in your pocket, after a week or two you're going to start to smell. You might try and trade somebody with it and they're going to be like, that fish is no good. So that's another thing with money, is you want it to where it's not going to spoil or go bad. So the very first money started with goods, and then something very interesting happens. Let's go to the next slide and see what happens. Somewhere along the way, many governments started to see that certain goods started becoming valued, because the nice thing about gold is that you would be able to use it for jewelry if you wanted to, but it was also limited in its supply. There's that word again, limited. And the thing is if you had this piece of gold, which was small and easy to carry and kind of like really beneficial to you, what you would be able to do is you could start to change it into, say, like a coin. A lot of just kind of early governments would start to actually make the move to try and have coins that were made out of gold, or better yet, if they started to make paper money, they would have it to where at any time you could go and trade in the paper money for gold. And a lot of times it would be a person that would do this, but eventually it would be governments that would do this. Now, when the very first change happens from people using paper money and, say, the gold it was backed up with, at any point you could actually go into the government, you could say, I'd like to trade this paper dollar for the piece of gold. And they would give it to you and you would be all set. However, eventually what governments do is they actually just stop doing that. They just say, we're not going to back it up with any gold. It's a little bit more efficient just to have it be the paper money. But people still think it's valuable, and the reason why they think it's valuable is because they've been used to it, and it's because it's limited in supply. Now in the United States, we know from our last unit that the Federal Reserve System is what keeps our supply of money limited. Anytime the government's kind of controlling the supply of the money to keep it limited or not, and it is this paper form of money, this is known as a fiat currency. So basically any money that doesn't have a backing is a fiat currency. And there's benefits and a couple drawbacks to having that you could probably go out and research, or you could pause the video and I can explain it to you in class. So that's kind of how money was born. It started being connected to a good, and then eventually it became its own kind of separate thing from a good completely, but people still viewed it as having value. When governments are putting out money, one of the things they try and do is keep just the right of money out. We learned about this in our last unit. If you put out too much money, then the value starts to crash. And if you don't put out enough money, then the value starts to go up. And that's essentially can lead to a depression. So if you're putting too much money in the economy, this can lead to inflation. And the interesting thing is that technically governments want to put just a little bit too much money into the economy at any given time. If they do that, then that means that if there's a little bit too much money out, that means banks typically will have a little bit too much money. And they can loan out their money to people, and that can start new businesses and things like that. However, if you don't put out enough money, then that will cause the value to go up for the money, which you think would be good. However, if there's not enough money, then banks don't have any extra money, and they won't be able to loan out to new businesses. So the economy isn't necessarily going to grow or get bigger. The people that do have money will be more valuable and will get them more stuff. The economy isn't necessarily going to grow because of it. So that's something kind of all governments work to do, is trying to put out the perfect amount of money with just a little bit too much. 1 to 3% a year is typically what governments shoot for. That's kind of the inflation rate that seems to do the best for economies. Now, if the inflation starts to get too out of control, like if the government starts printing off way too much money, maybe they're way in debt and they want to pay off their debt, so they just start printing money like crazy. If they start doing that, then it leads to this thing called hyperinflation. And that's kind of what we see in these pictures right here, is that you have these this little kid and this gentleman probably are going to go buy something as simple as maybe like a loaf of bread. But the inflation is so high that to get the loaf of bread, they have to bring what looks like just tens of thousands of dollars, which is just crazy. So that's something that has happened to countries before. The Google Classroom video, too much money, gets into this topic. And that's definitely bad. That does bad things for economy. because typically people will just stop using the currency, and then a lot of times they even have to go back to bartering again, and that's not the most efficient way to exchange. So dollars and money, like we just looked at, and fiat currency is one way that you can do business and exchange. Another interesting thing that people have come up with, this example is kind of interesting, is in New York, in the city of Ithaca, they've actually come up with their own currency. And the reason why that's interesting is because if you're in Ithaca, people there think that this money has value, and in addition, the supply of it is limited. So it works just like regular cash, like a dollar bill, for the same kind of reasons. People believe it has value, and it's limited supply. And there's a little video you can check out on Google Classroom that talks about that too. The most recent one that people are talking about in terms of a different type of currency is digital currencies, which Bitcoin is the one we're going to talk about for the next little bit. Bitcoin essentially does the same two things. It's limited in supply, and people think it has value. And for those two reasons, it also can be used as a form of currency. Now, the interesting thing about Bitcoin is it's not a central government that says how much the supply of Bitcoin there is. The thing that keeps the supply limited for Bitcoin, just like it says here, is that it has basically like cryptography happening. The best way I could explain this is if we went back to the very first Bitcoin. The very first Bitcoin started by somebody who had the idea of having a computer program where if you went to this person's site and you had your computer solve their math problem, you actually would get a Bitcoin. So I want you to picture that. So picture there being 0 Bitcoins. And all of a sudden this person puts this offer out here and somebody comes to the site and says, huh, I see your computer puzzle. I'll set my computer on it. And so they have their computer figure out this person's math problem in their site. And when they do that, maybe it takes the computer like an hour, and ta-da! Their computer solves the problem, and all of a sudden you have 1 Bitcoin that comes out. But this is a trick about Bitcoin. Every time you make a new Bitcoin, the problem gets more complicated the next time you do it. So every time you're making another Bitcoin, it gets basically more and more difficult to make a new one. And it takes more and more computing power to be able to solve the problem. And that's what this concept of mining is. Mining is where you're essentially trying to get new Bitcoins by having your souped up awesome computers like this one right here running day and night to try and solve these problems. But if they do, they can create new Bitcoin. So since there's no way to magically make Bitcoins appear, it has to follow this process. That keeps Bitcoin limited. And that's one of the main things that gives it its value. The biggest thing that's giving its value now is that since so many people now have heard of it, all of a sudden people are just like, wow, have you heard Bitcoin? It's making all kinds of money, like crazy amounts of money. Maybe I should look into Bitcoin. So what's happening now is since so many people are finding out about it, there's a demand for Bitcoin. And since there's a limited supply and the demand is going up, that's also causing the price to go up. One thing is for sure though, the amount of Bitcoin is limited, and I think it has even like an end date where there will be a point where not all the computers in the world could solve the problems. And that's part of what makes it this limited thing and makes it valuable. All right. The science or technology behind Bitcoin is actually this thing called blockchain. Blockchain is, just like it says there, a decentralized way to record economic transactions. Blockchain is one of the things that went on to create Bitcoin. The best way I could explain blockchain is blockchain lets, anytime there's going to be a transaction, whether it's somebody's trying to get Bitcoins or if you want to have somebody trying to buy something for a business, what blockchain can do is it will let everybody that's a part of the network essentially view every single transaction. And if all of a sudden something funny is going on with one of the transactions over here, the entire network all over the world can see that, and immediately everybody in the world can essentially void that and go back and fix it to the way it was before. So what this does is it allows everybody to know exactly what's going on, and it doesn't really let anybody cheat or steal at this point. So that's another thing that makes blockchain so valuable, and that's essentially what Bitcoin is built on. So if anybody tried to go in and mess with the Bitcoin website or somebody's Bitcoin purse over here, the whole network would know about it, and then they would be able to go back to before that happened and make the correction. And if you're kind of confused about that, you can raise your hand. I'll come over and kind of help you out. So it's kind of a lot of people say blockchain is going to be the future of commerce because it's a real safe, trusted way to change. There's also an awesome TED video on this that's also on the Google Classroom page as well. You can check that out as well. All right, moving on. Supply and demand, our last slide. So supply and demand, we talked a little bit about with Bitcoin, but the example I'm going to use to explain it is the Spirit Halloween stores. All right, so you guys know that every year when Halloween rolls around, you get all excited, trick-or-treating, I'm going to put on my awesome costume, and you get super pumped up to go trick-or-treating. And also there's other like businesses and haunted houses and things like that that people go to that are all different types of businesses. So what we're going to use for the example for supply and demand is Spirit Halloween. Whoever is like the person in charge of Spirit Halloween knows that as Halloween gets closer, the demand for Halloween costumes starts to go up. So as the demand goes up, right off the bat, you already know that you're going to start to be able to bring the price up. So what the Spirit Halloween person does is they then try and bring the, or they try and order the appropriate supply. So let's say, I'm trying to think what would be a big costume thing. Let's just say that the Descendants just came out from Disney and all of a sudden everybody wants to buy Descendants costumes. Well, if they know that the demand is going to be there, then they can order a bunch of Spirit costumes. And as long as the demand is high and they have enough of a supply, they can charge a certain amount. Let's say they could charge like $50 for a costume. They know they're going to get it, and they know they have enough for all the people who are going to come in. Wherever that balance is between the supply and the demand, wherever those kind of intersect, is known as your equilibrium. And that's kind of the just like it says up here, where products price should be where supply equals demand. So when you have supply and demand balancing out like that, that is equilibrium. That's where you would set your price. So if I have a high demand and I have a high supply, I know I've got, let's say, 10,000 people are going to be coming in the shop, and I order 10,000 Descendants costumes. I know I'm going to be able to charge $50, and I'm going to be able to make the maximum amount of profit. However, what happens the day after Halloween to the demand for Halloween costumes a lot of time? They start to go down. And if you leave your price way up here, you're not going to sell any. So what these Halloween stores do is they have to try and slash the price to try and get rid of any extra costumes that they have left over. So now the equilibrium price is going to drop. And that's exactly what happens when you go to these Spirit Halloween stores after Halloween. They're like 50% off, 75% off. They're doing everything they can, since the demand is so low, to try and get rid of the extra supply. And really it's the price coming down that helps to do that. Another example, if that one didn't work for you, is in the movie Frozen. A lot of you guys have seen Frozen. And there's a little video clip in here if you want to check out the scene. But in the movie Frozen, the character Kristoff, his whole job that he does is he meets the high demand for ice in the city. And since the price of ice, or since there's such a high demand for ice, he's able to sell it for a lot. So he goes out and does the, how does it go? Winter is so he's like getting the ice with all his family, and they pull out the blocks of ice. They've got a whole cart of ice, and they bring that huge supply down. They know people are going to be spending a lot of money because the demand is high for ice because it's summertime, and so then they're able to charge a high price, and they get a supply that they think is going to meet the demand. So say maybe they charge like $50 for a block of ice. But what happened in the movie Frozen? We know that Elsa goes all crazy and gets her powers and creates a eternal winter everywhere. And what that does is it flips things on its head. So all of a sudden you see Kristoff is just like, you want to talk about a supply and demand problem? I have a whole cart full of ice, and the demand for ice is zero. So even if he brings the price to zero, he probably still wouldn't be able to get rid of those ice blocks. So you always, anytime you're doing a business, and part of this unit is looking at businesses, business always have to kind of be aware of whatever the demand is and try and get the right amount of supply to try and match the demand. It's never perfect, and you can adjust your price to try and make up for it. But that's kind of always what you're looking for to get it to work out. So if this is still a little fuzzy, raise your hand. I'll come around and explain it to you. Otherwise, hopefully that makes sense. And I think that's our last slide. So thanks so much for coming out and watching the video. See you next time. Bye.